And so we're given this story so that thousands of years later, like you, sitting where you're at, in all of your hurt, in all of your trials, in all of your suffering, weighing and being burdened by the consequences of our own foolish choices, no matter what your situation is, this is written so that you sitting here can hear this. And I want you to hear this. I want to say to you, in the midst of your circumstance, whatever your specific situation is, I want you to hear this. Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer. Blessed be the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer. May his name be praised. May his name be glorified. May his name be renowned. Listen to me, your trial and your angst is not for nothing. Your hurt is not without purpose. Your frustration is not without a purpose. Whatever your situation is, there's a purpose in it. There's a design in it. There's an ordaining in it. And of course you can't see it. You don't have the eyes of eternity. Listen, God is doing something in the midst of that. Even if he's bringing something about that you're not even going to see with your eyes in your lifetime, even if the thing that why you are going through what you're going through is because God is doing something that is not going to come to light for another 4 generations, right? Naomi has no idea about King David. She's going to be long dead by the time David walks onto the scene. Long dead by the time Jesus Christ arrives. But that's what God is doing in her life. She could be sitting there saying, why am I going through all this? God is doing something. He is working in every situation. He is working all things for his eternal glory and by extension for your eternal good. Ruth chapter 4, verse 1. It says, now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, turn aside, friend, and sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. And he said, I will redeem it. Then Boaz said, the day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders of all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Amen. You may be seated. I hope that you have enjoyed our study in this Old Testament book this last month as much as I have enjoyed preaching on it. For me, the Book of Ruth has just been an incredible reminder that God is leading his people always. That even in the darkest of circumstances and situations, every trip to the hospital, every graveside tear, every discouragement, every betrayal, every loss, and even every victory, in all of it, God is moving us, he's moving his people toward our final destination, which is for our ultimate good and which is for his ultimate glory. My heart's resounding with just this, our Redeemer, our Goel lives, and we get to see him in that glory. And there is nothing more important than the fact that we have been reconciled to God, and God is glorified and will be glorified. I think those two truths far exceed the importance of anything else in our lives, including, might I add, our comfort. Right? That we have been redeemed and God is glorified is more important than how comfortable we are on a day-to-day basis. And we have seen in this book and even in our lives that the Lord often brings trouble and he brings calamity into our lives so that we will depend upon him alone. Now, I made a statement a few weeks ago along these lines. You have to have a God who can manage calamity and ordain calamity, and yet also can manage rescue from calamity and ordain rescue from calamity. I made this statement. I said, I will never say that God does evil or that God is evil or that God sins, but I will say that God does ordain that evil happen and that affliction come on his people at times. And I know that's troubling to a lot of people. And I know why. I know why we struggle with that. Because we understand that God is good. And we don't want to. We resist. We don't want to ascribe anything to him that would diminish his glory or that would diminish his goodness. And it's hard to see how he can be good and bring calamity into the lives of his children. But the Bible teaches that he does. And he is good, and he is bigger and more deep in his manifold characteristics, like beyond our imaginations. And I understand why people struggle with this, but I want to say to them, you need to allow God to be bigger than what's your perception of what he should be. You need to allow him to be bigger than that, because he is bigger than that. In Job chapter 2, verse 10, Job says, shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? They both come from him. In Isaiah 45, verse 7, I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. I am the Lord who does all of these things. And so I made this statement. You have to have a category in your head, in your brain, where you can understand that God is good and God does not sin, but he can ordain that sin happen and do it without sinning. And I thought of another example. You say, why are you lingering? Why are we going back to this? Because my intent today is this. We want to ask the big question as we're finishing up this book of Ruth. What's the big point? Like, what's the big idea? Like, what does this book teach us? And I had this thought this week because at the end of chapter 4, David is lauded as the hero of the book. In fact, the last word in this book is the word David, right? The story ends with a genealogical record tying Boaz and Ruth and Obed, their son, to David. And I think I mentioned that this book was obviously written probably during the monarchy, which means that the book was written after the period of the judges, right? So Saul became Israel's first king, and that ended in complete failure. And then David became king after him. And the reason we know is because he is mentioned in the book. And obviously our author knew who David was. Our author understood who David was, but he's writing about a time much, much earlier during the period of the judges. And in spite of all of his faults, David is the hero at the end of this book. He's mentioned twice. David is viewed historically as Israel's greatest king. There was never a king that was better in all of Israel's history than King David. We see this during the life of David in the book in 2 Samuel chapter 7. The prophet Nathan, he prophesies over King David. He speaks the word of the Lord to him. And in verse 12, the prophet says this. He says, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, he's speaking for the Lord, he says, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So we're talking about the throne, the kingdom of David. I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him as a father. He shall be to me as a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And your house, the house of David, and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. In Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 5, the prophet says this, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for who? For David. I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he shall reign as king and deal wisely and shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In his days Judah shall be saved, and Israel will dwell securely. And this is the name by which he will be called, the Lord our righteousness. And so we begin to understand that Jesus is a type, he's a shadow that comes after David, that sits on the throne of David, that rules the kingdom of David. He's the son of David, and that's Jesus. In Isaiah chapter 9, many of you know this verse, these verses well, but in verse 6, the prophet says, for to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Verse 7, of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, and on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. And so we see Jesus again coming as the fulfillment, as the son of David, sitting on the throne of David, ruling the kingdom of David. In Luke chapter 1, verse 32 and 33, the angel speaks to Mary, who's going to give birth to Jesus. And the angel says, he will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give to him the throne of his father David. And he will rule over the house of Jacob forever. And of his kingdom there will be no end. And whenever we see David in the New Testament, our attention immediately begins to shift toward Jesus. In Matthew chapter 1, Matthew actually begins his book with a genealogy, and he says, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of who? The son of David, the son of Abraham. And so when we come to Ruth, we read this as people living on this side of the cross. We look back on this, and whenever we see David, we're like, I know what that's about. Like that's pointing to the son of David, to the fulfillment of that. And so at the end of the book of Ruth, we see twice in verse 17, it says, the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And so our author is obviously tying this whole story, Ruth the Moabite coming to Bethlehem as a widow, and then being married to Boaz, and then having a son being given to them by God, and that son just wrapping right into the genealogy of David, and of Christ, right? In verse 22, it says, Obed fathered Jesse. This is the last verse in the book. And Jesse fathered David. So you're going to have to put on your thinking caps for just a second because we're going to go kind of deep here for a second. King David is written by our author, presumably during the life of David or shortly after the life of David, but David is included in this book and he's written as the hero, okay? Like everything about this story is leading to Jesse fathered David. It's David. That's our author is pointing us toward that. All this stuff that happened that we had all these questions about, and we're like, where's the justice in that? And our author is telling this, listen, it's all about David. This is how David got to where he's at. This is how God brought David into existence. And so verse 17 and 22 celebrate David. Now, again, you got to think with me here. My premise is that God does not sin. He is perfect, and he is just, and he is holy, but he does ordain that sin happen, and he does that without sinning. Again, I know that's difficult for a lot of people. But listen, think about this. Think about this for a second. Ruth is written after the period of the judges. It's written during the monarchy. It's during the establishment of the monarchy, and it's a story about events that took place during the period of the judges. Ruth, it's early in the period of the judges. We know this just by looking at the genealogy. Boaz, kind of one of our main characters, is the son of Rahab. And Rahab was the one who lived in Jericho, running her brothel in the walls of Jericho before Joshua and the Israelites came in and conquered the lands before the period of the judges. And so the period of the judges has just started because Boaz is here. He's old, but the fact that his mom is Rahab, which means that Rahab is going to become Ruth's mother-in-law. And so we know that this whole story happens early in the period of judges. And the reason that we have the book of Ruth is to provide a sneak peek and kind of a peek behind the curtains of what God is doing even in the darkest of times. And we've seen what he's doing. He's bringing a Moabite cursed Gentile woman to be a descendant of David and ultimately a descendant of David's greater son, Jesus. But this story of Ruth, again, written later during the monarchy, is taking place before there was a king in Israel. During the early period of the judges, before there was any Saul, before there was David. In fact, this story is taking place when there shouldn't have been a king in Israel. We understand that. When it was a sin to want a king in Israel. When it was a sin to even think about a king in Israel. When it was a sin to desire a king in Israel. All of that was a sin. That's when this story is taking place. Listen to this. In 1 Samuel, now this event is taking place near the very end of the period of the judges. But in 1 Samuel chapter 8, I told you, stick with me. This is deep. It says, Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Saul at Ramah and said to him, Behold, you are old and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now, appoint for us a king to judge us like all the other nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me as being king over them. In 1 Samuel chapter 12, just a couple chapters later, Samuel is pleading with the people who are in great distress, and Samuel is explaining why they're in the state that they're in, why they're in all of this angst. And in chapter 12, verse 12 of 1 Samuel, he says, And when you saw that Nahash, the king of the Amorites, came against you, you said to me, this is Samuel talking to the people, you said to me, No, but a king shall reign over us when the Lord your God was your king. He was your king and you didn't want him. You wanted somebody you could see. You wanted somebody like the rest of the nations. In verse 12, he says this, Is it not the wheat harvest today? I will call upon the Lord that he may send thunder and rain, And you shall know and see that your wickedness is great, which you have done in the sight of the Lord in asking for yourselves a king. There shouldn't have been a king in Israel. It was a sin to ask for a king. It was a sin to desire a king because it was rejecting God as your king. I mean, think about that. It was a sin to desire a king. That's the period that Ruth and Boaz are living in, where to have the thought, I want a king, that's sinful, it's wicked. And God judged the people because they desired a king. They're like, we want to be like all the nations around us. They have kings, we want a king. But it was a blasphemous sin. It was wickedness. And yet, hundreds of years earlier, while it is a sin to desire a king, this book is telling us a story and celebrating the fact that God is bringing a Moabite girl into the family who's going to be the great-grandmother of Israel's greatest king. Now, it's wild to think about that, where King David is being celebrated. Listen to me. King David is being celebrated when it's a sin to want a king. When it was a sin, and God is bringing this to happen. He's orchestrating events that are going to bring David to be king, and God wasn't sinning in doing that, but it is a sin to want a king. Like, that will melt your brain. Like, your brain, you think about that too deeply, and your brain will feel like my undercarriage after 126 miles of pedaling, right? It just hurts a little bit. It just hurts a little bit. And so, again, I say that you have to have a category for this. God was planning for David. God is ordaining and orchestrating events so that David will come into being. And all the time, God said during that time, it's a sin to want a king. And God's bringing a king into being. And God wasn't sinning in any of it. It's crazy to me the more I think about that. God is planning that there be a king when it's a sin for there to be a king. And that his son Jesus will be the son of that king. So that one day Jesus will be sitting on the throne of that king, reigning and ruling as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, so that at the very mention of his name, every knee would bow and every tongue would confess that Jesus is both Lord and King. And it was a sin for all of that to come about. I mean, Samuel says to the people, you've done a wicked thing in trying to bring about this kingship. So there's no way for God to rule the universe that he's created that brings you and me to Jesus as king without God ordaining that sin come to pass, without sinning. I mean, how God governs all of the events in the universe and ordains them to come to pass without sinning and, by the way, without removing the responsibility of man and doing it with compassionate outcomes is a mystery indeed. But that's what the Bible teaches, that God works all things according to Ephesians 1:11. He works all things according to the counsel of his will. And I don't always understand the why in every trial, but I do know this. Jesus Christ is our only hope. And his ability to direct every single event in my life and in your life, both the good, the bad, and the ugly, to be able to direct all of that for my eternal good and for his eternal glory. I believe in that. And I believe that when we make statements like this, well, God doesn't ordain that sin happen, but he can use it when it does. I believe, listen, as well-intentioned as that is, when we relieve God of his total sovereignty, we actually lose the only hope that we have, being God's sovereignty and his ability to direct events of our lives. We see it in the lives of the apostles. We see it in Job's life. We see it in Joseph's life. I mean, think about Joseph. His brothers sell him into slavery. They throw him in a pit. They lie to his father about what happened to him. They sell him into slavery. That's all sin, right? Those are sins. If you do those, you've sinned, right? They lied about it. They almost murder him. They kidnap. They sell him to these Midianite traders. That's a sin. Then he gets taken to the house of Potiphar. He's trying to serve there. As he's doing that, he gets lied about. Potiphar's wife makes a false accusation of rape. That's a sin, right? He goes to prison as an innocent man. That's a sin. It's sin, 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 all the way from the top down to the bottom. It's just nothing but sin. It's sin. And the Bible tells us in Psalm 105 that God says when he summoned a famine on the land and broke all the supply of bread, that God had sent a man ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. So in all that sinning, people responsible for their decisions, God was ordaining, he was sending a man in front of them. So what was happening there in all of the sinning against Joseph, in the mistreatment, in the abuse, in the lies, and in the slander? What's happening in all of that? I'll tell you what's happening in all of that. Salvation is happening in all of that. God was doing something. He's orchestrating. He's getting his man into a position of power in Egypt, and he's doing weird things to make that happen. And Joseph probably couldn't see what was happening when he's in the midst of it. But at the very end of it, he looks back on it and he says this in Genesis 50:20. He says, as for you, speaking to his brothers, he said, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. This is such a critical verse to your understanding. To be able to say in the midst of your trial, in the midst of your situation, listen, you had a design in this. You had a design in this, you implemented this, and you did it for evil malice, you did it for evil intentions, but God designed this differently. He had a purpose in it, and it was for good, and it was for salvation. Could I encourage you in this? If we could have the courage and the faith to be able to make that statement, to declare that statement regarding every situation in our lives, to be able to speak into the heavenlies, to regarding every sickness, every tragedy, every trial, every situation we find ourselves in, to be able to even say to Satan himself, Satan, you meant this for evil, but God means it for good. In every situation. And I recommend, listen, I realize when we talk about blanket statements, that's easy to say, but when you start thinking about the specifics in your life and your actual trials, that becomes quite the statement of faith. God means all things in my life for his eternal glory and my eternal good. I know I referenced some of this stuff at the beginning of this series, but I think that is the point of this book. In Acts chapter 4, verse 27, they're praying and they said, for truly in this city there were gathered against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, who all made choices, but to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. How did the cross happen? By sin. It was all sin. Everything about it was sin. When Herod put a purple robe on him and was like egging him on, I want to see a miracle, Jesus. I heard you do miracles. Show me something. Perform a miracle for me. That was sin. That was Herod sinning. When Pilate washed his hands and said, I don't see that this man has done anything wrong at all, but go ahead and kill him. That was sin. When the Gentile soldiers were beating him and when they spit on him and when they were grabbing his beard and yanking it out and they were punching him from behind and saying to him, prophesy to us, which one of us hit you? Like all of that was sin. When they nailed his hands and feet to a cross, when they gambled for his clothing, when they were pounding a crown of thorns into his head, and when they were jabbing him in the side with a spear, all of that was sin. When the Jews sinned, when they were screaming out, crucify him, mocking him on the cross, all of it was sin. Listen to me. All of it was sin. And all of it was scripted. When you go, we're not going to turn to it, but just write this down in your notes. When you turn to Psalm 22, if you read that, it describes in painstaking details the events that would take place on Calvary. And Psalm 22 was written 700 years before crucifixion was even invented. It wasn't even a thing. It would be 700 years before they would invent it, and then it would be another several hundred years for the Romans to get a hold of it and perfect it. And it was all scripted. And the people were responsible. I just don't think it gets any clearer than that. That God can ordain sin, that it happen, and not sin. So I'll say it again. This book is in the Bible for us to learn that God is at work directing and ordaining things and events and sin. Even in the darkest of times, God is ordaining and directing. Of course you can't see what he's doing. Of course you can't see his purposes in it. But he's working. He's working and he's doing things. And it's not necessarily for your immediate comfort in this life. But he's doing things for his eternal glory and for your eternal good in the life to come. That's what this book is about. All right. Verse 1. It says, now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken. It's funny that our author doesn't even mention his name here. Came by. So Boaz said, turn aside, friend, sit down here. He turned aside and sat down, and he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. So they sat down. So this is happening in the gate of the city, which if you try to imagine the walled cities, the way that these gates worked is there was a gate that you would come through. And it was really more like a big courtyard area. And then another gate opposite that gate. And so you'd have to go through that second gate in order to get into the city proper. But this courtyard area was considered the gates of the city. And lots of important things were happening there. This is where lawsuits oftentimes were held, where people needed a judgment on an issue that had happened. They would bring it to the city gates. The elders would hang out there oftentimes. And this is where you would come to find out what was happening in surrounding towns and in the surrounding region, because travelers would come through and you could be like, hey, where'd you come from? Tell us what news is going on. So there were social gatherings, all kinds of important things happened in this courtyard area, in the gates of the city. And so this is where Boaz goes, and he meets this man who's there, who's closer to Elimelech, Naomi's dead husband, in familial relation. And Boaz is going to lay out the case regarding what has happened and what's transpired to this area. Now remember, Boaz really likes Ruth, and Boaz wants to be with Ruth, right? But Boaz is a righteous guy. And so Boaz is committed to doing this right, doing it the right way. And so this guy has the right of first refusal, as it were. We'll talk about that in a second. But Boaz is going to strategically let him know what's going on. Boaz is not going to be deceptive about it, but he's going to be careful about what he says and how he says everything. Now, we need to kind of go into this law a little bit. We've talked about it, but I kind of want to explain a little bit more in detail. According to Old Testament law, property and land owned by an Israelite needed as much as possible to always stay within that tribe and clan of that landowner. That was paramount. That was one of the most important things, is that it stay with the family. Land ownership was hugely important. And so when one of these transactions would take place, what they would do is they would take a scroll and they would write the details of the land and the terms and the conditions of the property on these scrolls. And these were like title deeds of the land. And one copy was given to the owner of the land, so that he could have it, and it was open so he could read it and other people could read it and look at it. And another copy was rolled up and sealed with a wax seal and then kept securely, like within city vaults, away from the public, away from the possibility of tampering or editing. And no one was authorized to go in and break those seals and open those scrolls and tamper with them in any way. And so land could be passed as an inheritance from father to son, but there was always an untampered record that was locked up that people, and one that was not locked up, one that was available for people to see and read and examine. And if a landowner had no sons, if he died, if he had daughters, the land was passed on to her daughters or to his daughters. And to ensure that that land always remained in the clan, if you were a daughter who inherited the land, you couldn't just marry any Israelite. You had to marry somebody within your own clan. You can't marry outside of the clan. And that guaranteed that any heirs that would be produced would be considered part of that original landowner's clan and his lineage. You can read about that in Numbers 36. But if an Israelite fell into debt, he could actually, there was a couple things he could do. One of them is he could sell his debt to a relative, to a goel, who would then settle that debt. But in doing that, that land, everything that land produced would be considered to be that goel's, the profits went to him. And the seller, the original landowner, could continue to work the land in order to provide for his family, but all of the profits of that land would go to the purchaser, would go to the goel, in order to repay the debt that the goel had settled on behalf of the original owner. Now, there's an interesting thing that happened in Israel, because every 50 years you had something called the Year of Jubilee. Right? And what happened at the Year of Jubilee is that any land rights that had been transferred because they needed redeemed or debts needed to be settled, any of those land rights, they would automatically, at that time, revert back to the original landowner. And any debt that was owed to the Redeemer was actually canceled. And all slaves and bondservants and people who had come into debt and different things, they were freed, and all debt was basically canceled for good. This happened every 50 years. It was called the Year of Jubilee. And if the original owner of the land had died, right, and the landowner had sold, let me back up. If the original owner had died, then those land rights would actually revert to the heir of that landowner. And so the land, again, we see, always stayed within the same clan. That was the goal. But let's say that the landowner had sold the use of his land to a goel, to a redeemer, and then failed to produce an heir. In that case alone, the redeemer would actually retain ownership of the land upon the death of the landowner, since there was no heir to perpetuate the name of the landowner. The ownership of the land would then fall to the redeemer. And what would happen is that the redeemer, if he was related, if he was able, if he was willing, if he had gone in and redeemed that, would be able to go into the vaults. Now listen, he's the only one that could do this. And he would get that title deed out. He would grab that title deed scroll and he would break the seal on it. Nobody else could do that, just him. He would fulfill the conditions of the scroll, and now that property would then belong to him. But we see again, since land ownership by God's design was so important, every possible effort was made to try to keep the clan and keep the tribe of the original landowner, to let that remain with them. And so in cases, in situations like Ruth, like Naomi's in, a childless widow of a dead landowner, the widow then could sell the rights to a redeemer, to the goel, but the redeemer, the goel, would need to take upon himself the responsibility of marrying the widow and producing offspring. And then the offspring were considered heirs of the deceased one, so that the land would pass to those heirs and remain within the clan and the tribe of the original landowner. But the redeeming of the land also came with it the responsibility of caring for and providing for the widow and her house, her remaining house. So in the story before us, Naomi is the owner of the piece of land and all the property that had belonged to her husband Elimelech. And not only had Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, but so had her sons. And so she had no biological children to inherit the land. And Naomi's evidently too old to be able to have children, but Ruth, her daughter-in-law, is still of childbearing age. And so according to the Redeemer law, a relative could be able to purchase those land rights, but along with that came the responsibility to marry Ruth with the goal of producing an heir, who those heirs would then receive the land as inheritance, thereby keeping it within Elimelech's clan and tribe. And so Boaz begins to strategically tell this other redeemer the situations, the detail of this situation in front of the other elders of the city. In verse 3, he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it, redeem it. Buy it in the presence of those sitting here. He's going to buy it, but if there's an error, he's going to lose it in 50 years. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. And he said, I will redeem it. I'm going to do my job. I'm the one. I'm first. I will redeem it. I'm a relative. I'm able. I'm willing. Now, Boaz makes, when he tells him about this, I think he's very strategic in the way that he does it. He makes the land the central issue because he knows that the land is the central issue for this guy. Boaz hasn't even mentioned the land because Boaz doesn't need the land. He doesn't care about the land. He probably doesn't even want the land. He's already got lots of land. He wants the girl, right? He wants the girl, but he knows this guy doesn't care about the girl, doesn't even know the girl exists. He just wants the land. And he wants the land for himself because this guy is probably thinking, this is a sweet deal. There is land available, buying land, accumulating land for my offspring, for my kids, for my grandkids is a very, very difficult thing to do. There's land available. The current owner is a she, and she's too old to have any heirs, which means I can buy the land from Naomi, and when Naomi dies, because there's no heirs of Elimelech, I get to keep it. It's going to be mine, and then it's going to belong to me permanently, and I have a much bigger thing to give my kids when I pass along. I mean, talk about a lucrative deal, right? So he says, I will redeem it because it's going to be mine. I'm not going to lose it in 50 years. And about this time, if you're reading this, right, and you don't know the whole story, you're thinking, no, like, I don't want this to happen. This is about Ruth and Boaz, not Ruth and what's his name? Like, we don't even know the guy's name. But Boaz is ready for this eventuality because there's one more piece of information that he has withheld up to this point. Verse 5, then Boaz says, the day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. This Redeemer, being a Jew, probably recoiled at that statement, right? Like, ew, a Moabite? like, remember God's trash can? No, thank you. Like, that's gross. They are a cursed people. You know, he knew the Bible. He knew the Moabite shall not enter into the Lord's sanctuary, even to the 10th generation. And he's like, no amount of land is worth this. So he says in verse 6, he says, the Redeemer said, I can't redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm the transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders of the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. So that information, that there's a girl that comes with the field. It's Ruth the Moabite. And I think he says it like that. There's a stigma that comes with Ruth the Moabite that this guy isn't willing to bear. Boaz doesn't care. Like, he's willing to suffer the shame and the reproach of marrying a Gentile, cursed, bride because of his love for her. Remember the three things. He's a kinsman. He's of relation. He's in the clan. He's in the family. He's able to do it. He can afford it. He can pay the price, and he's willing. Now, if we're going to be really gracious with this other guy, which I don't know if he deserves this, but if we're going to be really gracious with this other guy, we would say he is related. He does have the means. He can afford the price, but he's unwilling when he hears Ruth the Moabite, right? Presumably, he had wife and children. Maybe he felt like that's just going to get, again, we're being really generous to this guy to say maybe he just thinks this is going to confuse things for his own family. And he's saying, man, I can't do this. I don't think my wife is going to be stoked when I tell her that I'm going to take another wife and have kids with her. She's just not going to like that very much. And so he calls off the deal. And Boaz, of course, is very excited. There's a parable in Matthew 13:44 that Jesus tells. He says, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. That's Boaz. Boaz doesn't care about the field, right? He's found a treasure named Ruth, and he's willing. He can afford the price. He's a relation, and he's willing. He's the one who can be able to take that title deed scroll. He can open up the seal. He can redeem the family. That he can do that. He's qualified. He's worthy to be able to do that. In verse 11, it says, then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah, that's the region around Bethlehem, and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. By the way, Rachel was buried really close to this area in Bethlehem. You can go to Israel today and see the tomb of Rachel. So that's everyone's excited. Everyone's very excited. Now we get to the really good part. Verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, she became his wife, he went into her, and the Lord did something here. The Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. And the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer. May his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And then in verse 18, our author gives us his genealogy. It's just a short genealogy, and he begins with Perez. Perez was the son of Judah. Judah was the son of Jacob. It went Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, Perez, right? That's the lineage. That's the line. And Perez is probably the generation that was coming out of slavery in Egypt. But it says Perez fathered Hezron, Hezron fathered Ram, Ram fathered Amminadab, Amminadab fathered Nahshon, Nahshon fathered Salmon, Salmon fathered Boaz, Boaz fathered Obed, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. Now, I want to go back and I want to call your attention to verse 14. Because when we read this story, we think of Ruth as the main character. After all, the book is named after her. But she's not the main character. Like, if anything, as far as the women are concerned, this is a story about Naomi, right? This story began with Naomi as the one who said, the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. The Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. And our author is now, at the end of the book, he's bringing that like full swing all the way around. And in verse 14, it says, then the woman said, not to Ruth, then the woman said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord. Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a Goel. Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you without a Redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. May his name be renowned in Israel. Now, who are they talking about? If you stop reading at the end of that verse, your answer is probably Boaz. Like, he's the Redeemer. He's the one who redeemed. He's the one who provided for them. He's the one who married Ruth. He's the father now of Obed. Like you answer Boaz, may his name be renowned in Israel. And if you said Boaz, you'd be wrong, because it's not Boaz. The next verse. Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer. May his name be renowned in Israel. He, verse 15, presumably still the redeemer, in verse 14, he shall be to you, number one, a restorer of life. Number two, a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, Ruth, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Has given birth to the Redeemer. So they're not talking about Boaz as the Redeemer anymore, but rather the baby, right? It's the baby, the heir, the line. The heir is the Redeemer. Naomi had returned to Bethlehem. She had returned empty and bitter, and now she's full of joy, having received God's good gifts to her in Ruth and Boaz and now Obed. Obed is going to be a restorer of life and a nourisher of old age to Naomi. Naomi is now a typical grandma, right? She is a typical grandma whose face just lights up when she's holding her grandbaby. And so Obed was a redeemer in that sense. He's the heir. He's the continuing of the family line, of that lineage. But our author is actually really clear where he's going in this, because our author is not terminating on Obed. That's why we have the genealogy. That's why we have all this person begot this person and this, and you're thinking, anybody ever wonder, why do we have all the genealogy? He's given us the genealogy because he's not settling on Obed. He's pointing somewhere else. And we aren't meant to land and stay on this baby as the Redeemer. Twice in the last few verses, he mentions King David, our hero of the story. King David. Obed is a redeemer, and you can choose to kind of read it in that wooden structure, but our author is intentionally trying to draw our attention beyond Obed, because Obed points to King David. And of course, we know as Christians that King David's not even the end of the story, because there's coming one, the son of David, who will sit on the throne of David and rule the kingdom of David. King David was simply a foreshadowing of our greater, ultimate, wonderful Redeemer, our great Goel, our great Redeemer, Jesus Christ, the one who also came from Bethlehem to redeem a Gentile cursed bride who did not consider it a reproach to do what he did, but rather lowered himself and condescended himself to get down to be able to redeem this bride because of the great love that he has for her. And so we're given this story so that thousands of years later, like you sitting where you're at, in all of your hurt, in all of your trials, in all of your suffering, weighing and being burdened by the consequences of our own foolish choices, no matter what your situation is, this is written so that you sitting here can hear this. And I want you to hear this. I want to say to you, in the midst of your circumstance, whatever your specific situation is, I want you to hear this. Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer. Blessed be the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer. May his name be praised. May his name be glorified. May his name be renowned. Listen to me. Your trial and your angst is not for nothing. Your hurt is not without purpose. Your frustration is not without a purpose. Whatever your situation is, there's a purpose in it. There's a design in it. There's an ordaining in it. And of course you can't see it. You don't have the eyes of eternity. Listen, God is doing something in the midst of that. Even if he's bringing something about that you're not even going to see with your eyes in your lifetime, even if the thing that why you are going through what you're going through is because God is doing something that is not going to come to light for another 4 generations, right? Naomi has no idea about King David. She's going to be long dead by the time David walks onto the scene. Long dead by the time Jesus Christ arrives. But that's what God is doing in her life. She could be sitting there saying, why am I going through all this? God is doing something. He is working in every situation. He is working all things for His eternal glory and by extension for your eternal good. David points to Jesus. Jesus points to the resurrection of all things, the resurrection of our bodies, where there's going to be no more crying, no more pain, no more guilt, because the Bible says the former things have passed away. Listen to me. God's plans are always bigger than yours. Always. Sometimes we get so introspective and we get so self-focused and we're complaining about the mess and the thing that our life seems to be right now, and we're lamenting that nothing ever goes right and it's just always so hard, and we're expecting God to come in and fix everything now and make me feel comfortable. We have to remember that Ruth is given to us so that we remember that God has a far longer vision than we do. He's doing something in the life of Ruth and Naomi that they will not see in their lifetime. He's preparing the way for our great Redeemer. He's working in the darkest of times. He's ordaining everything according to the purposes of His own will, to the praise of His own glory. Our Goel, our kinsman, he's related to us now. He's able to pay the cost. He's able to pay the cost, which is His own blood, and He's willing to take the shame and the reproach of an unfaithful, cursed Gentile bride and be our great Redeemer and lay claim on us to say, you belong to me. There's one more verse I want to look at before we close. And the reason I want to turn there is because when you understand all of this, there's a verse in Revelation that just gets really beautiful. In Revelation chapter 5, John is having a vision. And he says this. He says, then I saw at the right hand of Him who was seated on the throne a scroll, written within and on the back, sealed with the 7 seals. And I saw a mighty angel proclaiming with a loud voice, who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals? And no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth was able to open the scroll or to look at it. And I began to weep loudly because no one was found worthy to open the scroll or to look at it. And one of the elders said to me, weep no more. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered so that He can open the scrolls and its 7 seals. And between the throne and the 4 living creatures and among the elders, I saw a lamb standing as though it had been slain, with 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into the earth. And He went and took the scroll from the right hand of Him who was seated on the throne. And when He had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each holding a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sang a new song. And the song that they sang was this: worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain, and by your blood you redeemed. That's the word there. By your blood you redeemed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nations. Friends, we have been redeemed by our great Redeemer, by our great Goel. And I pray that you would hear this, that you would fly for refuge under the mighty wings of God, that you would take comfort and shelter there, and you would embrace our great Goel. I just want to say, may His name be renowned in all the earth. Can you say amen to that? Let's pray.